Six. Great. You're about to be on. Um, Not yet. Welcome. She has to. I don't know. It's like an arm length thing. Get it far enough, but close enough to be able to touch it. Do you know what you're doing here? It's just a mute button. Six. Channel six. Okay, but it's not on. There's a red light because it's muted. All right. Good news. We're here. Now try it. See, there it works.
Good
Just a mute
evening.
button. Hi, Bill.
Hi, Kirk.
Thanks for joining me.
You're welcome.
It's great comedy. We're super organized. Chelsea's not here. She's hopefully holding baby Kyrie pretty soon. I don't know.
They've got him named already?
Yeah,
He's late to the party then.
yeah. He's late. So here we are.
It's good to be here.
My fantastic replacement. We are in the book of Matthew today, which is not entirely accurate, but we are. We are going to actually read some scripture today.
Hey.
First time in a few weeks, so
Yeah, I'm looking at this. 1 through 17 is the hardest
yeah.
verses. You're going to read it.
Okay. Normally, this would be the place where Chelsea would look at it and look at me and go,
No.
"I cannot do this."
I read.
There's a lot of names. This is a genealogy. We are going to read a genealogy. Jumping ahead of ourselves. Great to see you. Last week we talked about the Gospels.
That's right.
What was the term we used for? Do you remember?
Don't you do this. He does this to Chelsea.
Yeah. I used it Sunday too. So you've had two good opportunities to remember this thing. But now that you have a microphone and you're on the spot, you'll not remember it. Euangelion.
Euangelion.
Yes, good news. That's right. The gospel. We
Great.
have the Euangelion according to Matthew. And that's where we're at today. What's some things that we try to do with the four gospels? Have you ever heard the term harmony
Yes.
of the Gospels?
Read the book.
Yeah, we take
Harmony.
the Gospels and we try to explain away how they all lay together. Even a lot of people will say that there's a Q material. Have you ever heard that term, Q? Q material? So they will say a lot of scholars will try to harmonize the Gospels, especially the synoptic Gospels. Do you know?
Yeah, but
Matthew, Mark, Luke, they try to tell them, hey, they're all telling the same story because they have this Q material, this source material that they call Q material. That's all the same that all of them use that influence their writing of the gospel.
it's kind of like they took a script and said,
Yeah.
okay, now I'm going to tell my version, and it's not true.
And there are a lot of people that say there was some type of so historians will call it Q material. Another term that you can search is didache. This one. You
Wow.
say that didache. And a lot of scholarly people will call that like the teaching of the first century church. The apostolic organization of the gospel of how they would teach it. I think when we start using these terms, we begin to lose and overlook some specific things. So I would like for us to understand, and this is going to be tough to swallow and really digest without some community. So I encourage you to connect with somebody and really start to hash this out as we walk through it. But I really think we should stop trying to harmonize the Gospels and really take them for what they are individually, because we have four unique authors giving four unique perspectives.
Well, they're different backgrounds, totally.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they have unique audiences that they're intending to write to.
Right.
So the first thing we want to do in our conversation is I would like for us to very quickly, this is not going to be like an exhaustive conversation, but it is going to be a very quick conversation about who is the author here. Now, there's going to be conversation. We're not going to hang our hat. We're not going to build a whole theology and argument around who and what. But here's what I believe when it comes to the four Gospels. I believe that Matthew wrote the book of Matthew. There's a lot of people who want to argue that, but I believe that Matthew wrote the book of Matthew. I believe that the man we know as John Mark in the book of Acts wrote the book of Mark. The man we know as Luke in the book of Acts wrote the book of Luke. And John, the disciple John, who has a very unique perspective, different from everybody else's perspective and experience. So he writes a gospel that's very unique to everybody else's gospel, wrote the book of John. There are going to be a lot of, when you get the gospel and when you get the Bible, there are so many arguments. I think people want to argue just to argue over that comma's in the wrong spot. If you look at the Hebrew or the Greek, you know. So there's a lot of arguments about that. But so we're going to look at Matthew and understand Matthew as the writer of the book of Matthew. And Matthew also has another name. Do you know his other name? He's referred to by in the New Testament, specifically in this. Levi. And Levi was called from where? What was he? He was called, and he was doing what?
He was a tax collector.
He was a tax collector.
Sitting in the
booth.
Yeah, in the booth.
The collector's booth.
Yeah, and looked upon as not the right person.
Yeah, and we're going to have conversation about that here later today and why that's significant. So, author is a Jewish tax collector named Matthew. And his intended audience is a Jewish person.
Yes.
So this is a book, a recollection and a communication of the gospel written by a Jewish tax collector to the Jewish people. And there's some significance to that. Now, you like some scholars believe with the star?
Yeah.
Okay.
Ominous.
This is my, believe it or don't believe it, some people say. There are some that believe Matthew is actually the earliest of the Gospels written. I'm not sure which position I believe. Historically, most people would say that's the book of Mark. But there are some who believe that the book of Matthew was the first written. And there are also some scholars, very few, but some scholars that believe and argue that the book of Matthew was originally written in Hebrew. If that were true, and if that is true, then it would be the only book in the New Testament originally written in Hebrew. Which would make sense if the conversation is it's a Jewish book written to Jewish believers. Or not even Jewish believers, just Jews.
Mm-hmm.
Using their language would make sense.
Right.
Go ahead. I just see your wheels turning. I didn't say I believe it. I just said there are some who say.
Some who say that it was written in Hebrew.
Originally, yes. Now here's the challenge to that. We don't have any manuscripts that have it in Hebrew. We don't have any official textual evidence that is a Hebrew version of the book of Matthew, which makes that position very hard to defend. So, again, a lot of interesting things there.
Well, according to this study Bible that I have, some scholars say it was written in the 80s or 90s.
Yep.
And other scholars say it was written in the 60s before the destruction
Of the temple.
of the temple in
Yeah.
the 70s.
Yes. So
That's a
we
30-year
definitely
span.
we definitely have a very concise,
Guesstimate.
overwhelming
Guesstimate.
belief, understanding of this is definitely when it was written.
Right.
So I would tend to believe that it's earlier, and so
Then it would be the first written.
could be. I don't know. I think their belief is the book of Mark is like 50s. 56 is the number that's rolling around in my head. Like 56 AD is the number that's rolling around in my head, and I could be way off on that number, but that's what is bouncing around in my head.
Well, then
It's 56
my question
AD for
would
the book
be:
of Mark.
is that the first century church?
Yeah.
If we go from Jesus being born in the first century,
Yes.
my question would be: what took them so long to write this down?
That's a great question. Persecution, movement.
They didn't have any place to go to write it.
That would make sense. Many of these books were actually penned for the first time, written down while someone was imprisoned. Which,
Right.
like for Paul, most of what he did was written like while he was under house arrest.
Yeah.
So a lot of his writings technically were penned before the Gospels were actually penned, which would be a strange happening, right? But Paul definitely died in 64 AD. So all his writings, all his letters were all prior to that.
Well, do you think maybe that would be why Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and even John wrote theirs afterwards, after they could find some space?
I would almost, which I mean, I think there's two kind of conversations, like the finding space, but were they even like Matthew was? I don't know when he would have died, but it couldn't have been much after Paul, if not before. John was the last of the disciples to die. So, I think when we have this conversation, so I think there's 2 points of that we can. Did they find extra time or find some relief in some place of peace and rest and be able to write down almost as like an autobiography or memoir, or did the letters of Paul to the churches really give them motivation to go ahead and write down?
Well, maybe I better tell my story because I was there.
Yeah, I was there. So as Paul's telling them, stay faithful to the gospel, well, the next generation who didn't hear the gospel firsthand from someone who experienced it firsthand needs to have a firsthand account that they can pass on. So when we tell them to be faithful to that gospel, they have somewhere to go back to. So we can put that all together.
Yeah, well, if we say Matthew wrote to the Jews, not necessarily the Jews in Jerusalem, but the Jews,
period,
that could get a hold of this manuscript or hear it from someone, and to say,
which I think this conversation really, for me, gives more credence to it was written prior to the destruction of the temple,
right?
And then, with these type of things, it was very often that it was penned and then duplicated and handed out.
Well, he could have written it with a scribe, obviously,
right?
But then it might have been hidden away, to avoid destruction.
Very, very possible, and it could have been written in Jerusalem and then translated and carried off to Antioch. I mean, so there is a potential that if it's written earlier and it's written in Hebrew and it's in Hebrew only around Jerusalem, but handed off in Greek to the Greek-speaking world through the church at Antioch, that when Jerusalem gets destroyed in AD 70, it's part of the fallout. So I mean, there's so many ifs and potentials. You know what I mean?
Questions we get to ask later.
Yeah. It'd be great to have a conversation with Matthew in heaven if that's how it all works out.
He's not too busy.
Yeah. But as we're having this conversation, what's something that happens that's something that's very unique in the Jewish world, specifically, that would be more significant to the Jewish people than it would be probably to anybody else, is the lineage.
Yeah, genealogy.
The genealogy of who Jesus is.
Well, that has always been important to from Chaldean time forward.
Oh, absolutely.
They didn't have a way to write it down. They didn't have it had to be an oral teaching. It had to be handed down generation to generation to generation.
And they had to know where their generations went back to because they had a claim from somewhere based on who their inheritance came through.
Right.
And they're looking to restore a kingdom, right?
Right.
And that kingdom is someone's. Whose is it?
Well, it's important to know who your daddy was.
Right. And so the throne of Israel belonged to an offspring of what person? David. At this time. They're looking for a king of David, right?
Right.
Offspring of David. So that's what they're looking for. So this is pretty significant. And so if you have your Bible, we're going to read through this really exciting, probably your favorite thing to ever read, Matthew chapter 1. We're going to get this Jewish definition of who Jesus is. And I'm going to make a statement, and then I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to argue with that statement that was made. So most Bible teachers, especially Bible college New Testament teachers, will teach you about Matthew. There's two things going on here. One, overwhelming theme, kingdom of heaven, which is unique from the other Gospels. And two, very unique thing here. If we do believe Matthew to be a Jewish book written to Jewish people, Matthew is from the very beginning, according to most scholars, especially Bible college scholars, Matthew is trying to let the Jewish person understand the foundation and build the case that Jesus is the Messiah. He is the Christ that they're looking for. Okay? All right. That's my statement. I'm going to read the genealogy now. Matthew chapter 1, verse 1. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham.
Good place to start.
Yes. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ. Okay, when he's referred to as Jesus Christ, he is specifically saying this is the Christ. He didn't call him Jesus of Nazareth. He calls him Jesus Christ. So he is the Christ. He is the Messiah that we're looking for. That's my claim, and now I'm going to indicate. All right. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Ram, and Ram the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon the father of Salmon, and Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David the king. And David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah, and Solomon the father of Rehoboam, and Rehoboam the father of Abijah, and Abijah the father of Asaph, and Asaph the father of Jehoshaphat, and Jehoshaphat the father of Joram, and Joram the father of Uzziah, and Uzziah the father of Jotham, and Jotham the father of Ahaz, and Ahaz the father of Hezekiah, and Hezekiah the father of Manasseh, and Manasseh the father of Amos, and Amos the father of Josiah, and Josiah the father of Jeconiah, and his brothers at the time of the deportation of Babylon.
14.
And after the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Shealtiel, and Shealtiel the father of Zerubbabel, and Zerubbabel the father of Abiud, and Abiud the father of Eliakim, and Eliakim the father of Azor, and Azor the father of Zadok, and Zadok the father of Achim, and Achim the father of Eliud, and Eliud the father of Eleazar, and Eleazar the father of Matan, and Matan the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called Christ. So all their generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations, and from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations. From the deportation to Babylon to the Christ, 14 generations. This is the genealogy of Jesus as written by Matthew. Do you have any problems with this genealogy?
Yeah. Joseph.
Okay. Any other problems with this genealogy?
Well,
what type of culture is the Hebrew culture, the Jewish culture? It would be an ancient, what type of culture? Patriarchal culture. So this genealogy should be singularly focused on what? Who's your daddy?
Right.
Who's your daddy's daddy? Who's your daddy's 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 daddy?
Yeah. All the way back to Abraham.
So the only reason we would include not daddy in here means it has to be pretty significant. Yes?
Yes.
He skips a few generations. It's not, he does a few gymnastics that we in the Western culture would go, well, that's not right. That person wasn't born from that person. There was like 2 generations between those 2 people. So who's those 2 daddies that got from here to here? And so we would say, well, it's not exactly 14 generations and 14 generations and 14 generations, but a Jewish person would go, oh, well, that makes sense. They wouldn't even ask any questions. This is here not because it's factually, specifically true, but because it's proving a point that it's about time. Abraham came and there was a promise, and that promise was fulfilled in David, and David was there, and there was a promise, and that promise was fulfilled 14 generations later when they were carried off. And when they were carried off, they were given another promise through the prophet Isaiah, right?
Right.
That God went with them, that He was with them, but He was sending a Savior, right? This is in the was it Isaiah? Ezekiel. That's the wheel in the wheel. Yeah. Ezekiel. Well, then 14 generations later, it's about the right timing. They're like, okay, this makes sense. Matthew might be the worst Jewish genealogy ever written. Ever written.
Well, it sounds good.
It sounds pretty good, but it is absolutely okay. So some things that I have some problems with. Abraham was father of Isaac. Isaac the father of Jacob. Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. Do we care who his brothers are? Is it important?
Yeah.
Why is it important?
The 12 tribes.
Okay, that's fine. 12 tribes. But does it matter when it comes to who Jesus is?
No.
No, it doesn't.
Not as far as lineage goes.
Do we need the information that the other information that we got? Do we know the story? And do we have the story to know, well, if Judah was his father and Judah had a son and his name was Perez, do we know where Perez came from? Well, we have a clear indication in the book of Genesis where Perez came from. But he wants to make sure that we understand, hey, I need you to know Abraham's father Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. And then Judah from Tamar had Perez and Zerah. Zerah, not important. If you're building a genealogy that you are like trying to tell the story, is this Tamar story one you're going to be like, hey, let's highlight this?
I understand it, though.
It is for highlighting. It's very important. I disagree. So I disagree. And here's why. Here's why I'm going to disagree. Okay, if you're building a Jewish genealogy. You don't include the daughter-in-law whose husband died, who dressed up like a shrine prostitute that you slept with and gave a pledge to, and then came back and she wasn't there. And then you're going to have her killed. And she says, I'm pregnant by whoever's these are, and it happens to be you. You usually would leave that person out of the lineage. It makes the lineage... If you're trying to tell a story that we have perfection in the flesh, we probably want to leave out the problem in the backstory.
Right.
We want to leave that skeleton in the closet because...
So why did he include it?
Okay, we're going to get there. Let's continue on. The other problems that I had. In that same 14, who's the next person mentioned that is kind of out of place? No, before Ruth, there's somebody else. Rahab.
Yeah. Another.
Who's Rahab? Yeah, she hid them.
She was
at Jericho, so she's a Canaanite.
Right.
Prostitute.
Right.
Who protected them. The Canaanite prostitute gets brought in. So our heritage, as we're leading down to Jesus, includes
two prostitutes.
Two prostitutes. A fake prostitute and a real prostitute. And then a couple generations later, we get who? Is it 2 generations? It might be just one. So Boaz is born from a woman who is a prostitute. And then Boaz is the father of Obed. By
Ruth.
Ruth is a Moabitess. And according to Jewish law, that Moabitess who birthed Obed,
unclean.
She's unclean, and she can't enter the temple for 10 generations. That's the law. So we included her in this lineage. And 2 generations after her, we get to David. And David, we're going to say, hey, he had Solomon by the wife of Uriah. Look, we're going to have to throw that little footnote in there. Hey, he was somebody else's wife.
So an illegitimate child.
That's a great word. So we've got... Oh, yes. Well, he wasn't illegitimate, but the baby that was illegitimate died. So it wasn't a clean...
transition, yeah.
It wasn't clean. There was a lot of illegitimacy going on here. And that's going to be the word that we use for Matthew. Mamzer is the word we're going to use. And mamzer in the Jewish term, you can look it up. It has the connotation of illegitimate. Why would that be so significant? Why would these things be so significant to Matthew? What was Matthew doing when Jesus found him?
Collecting taxes.
He was collecting taxes.
For the Romans.
For the Romans. At some point here, in Matthew's experience, he had given up on his heritage.
Right.
As a Jew. He had been so broken and hurt and so ostracized that he had given up his rights and his inheritance as a Jew and sold himself to the Romans, the oppressive Romans, as a place to fit in.
Do we know that he would have had an inheritance? We don't know if he was a...
Well, he was Jewish. So he had some type of cultural inheritance anyway.
Yeah, okay.
And he sold it. He mortgaged it to work for the Romans and collect taxes. He was ostracized. He was outcast. He was, to the Jews, a tax collector would be an illegitimate Jew.
Okay.
They wouldn't associate with them. They wouldn't talk to them. Like they literally would use the term sinners and tax collectors. And when they use the term sinners and tax collectors, they're talking about people who are so unclean and so outside of the Jewish law that they weren't welcome in the temple. And they weren't welcome at Sabbath, at Shabbat services and celebrations in the home.
Okay.
This is the person who Jesus calls. And this is the person who ends up giving this gospel account on purpose.
But when Jesus called him, he got up and walked away from his.
He walked away from tax.
Good job, yeah.
Yes. And now he's going to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ. And he's going to say, hey, I'm going to set this stage. This is not about Jesus is the Christ. I'm going to make that assumption. But I'm not trying to prove to you that he is the Christ. I'm going to give you an euangelion, which is what?
Good news.
Why would they declare a euangelion?
They were looking for a king.
There was a king. There was a new kingdom. And this kingdom, according to Matthew, and this is why we're going to fit so much on the book of Matthew, is this gospel, this kingdom that is here for all of you who feel like you're illegitimate and outcast and ostracized and unaccepted.
So this is why he included Ruth's.
This is why he included all these people. He said, you may think that this history, if this is your history, that you have no reason to be accepted. But the gospel that he brings, the kingdom that he brings, the declaration of this account that he brings, is all those people who were outcast and ostracized from the temple and from the access to who God was and from the promise. Over and over again in the Gospel of Matthew, we're going to see him make the statement that Jesus said, he's going to say to the outcast, the Samaritan, I haven't seen so much faith in all of Israel.
Right.
We're going to see him condemning. In the book of Matthew, it is a controversial gospel when we really look at it. Because all the people who were outcast, he's like, accepted, accepted, accepted. All the people who are on the inside, he's going to talk about Jesus' condemnation of them. Yes, he's going to very much focus on Jesus challenging the people who thought that they were something and reaching out to the people who were told that they were nothing. And this is why, beginning right here, Matthew sets the tone of the mamzer position, of this desire for God to chase down the illegitimate and the outcast.
So he wasn't writing this for the clean Jews. He was writing this for the unclean Jews.
I would say for the Jews who
didn't feel Jewish.
The Herodians and the Sadducees. Right. So they did definitely write it. He definitely wrote it to the Jews, but he's talking to, he's definitely talking to all of them. He's trying to challenge this position of, I've arrived. I have access to this because of who my parents were, or we have all of this opulence because of what God has given us and God prefers us over you. That's not in any way, shape, or form what the gospel is. And so we get this challenge. And so I told you there was two things, right? That most Bible scholars, especially Bible college teachers, talk about the book of Matthew and they say, well, Matthew is building the case for Jesus is the Messiah. Matthew assumes that Jesus is the Messiah and then goes on telling you if you're an outcast, this is... So I disagree with that point. Secondly, kingdom of heaven. Yes, Matthew does use the term kingdom of heaven over and over and over again. Uses the statement kingdom of God one time in all of the book of Matthew. All the rest of the Gospels almost exclusively say the kingdom of God. But the book of Matthew says the kingdom of heaven. There's a reason for that. So the first century Jewish person would not say the name of God.
Right.
It was too holy.
Yes. Some devout Jews still don't.
Still don't. This is right. They might say Adonai, referring to God, but they will not say Yahweh.
Yeah.
They will often say the name, Like literally there's a word, and I cannot think of it right now, but there's a Hebrew word that means the name. They're referring to the name of God. And so how do we have this conversation about who God is without saying God's name? Matter of fact, they won't even refer to the temple as the temple. They will say the house when they're talking about the temple. So they're
the house of the name.
Yes, the house of the name. They are opposed to saying, like, referring directly to the presence of God or to the name of God.
Right.
Because they believe it's too holy for them to just be comfortable with using. So that's how they interpret, don't take the Lord's name in vain. Don't make it just commonplace.
We talked about how holy the word was.
Yes.
With the
Essenes.
Essenes in Qumran, who, when they got to the point of writing God down, they get up, go take a bath, come back, yes, write it, and then move stop on again and move on.
Every time they came to the Essenes when they were writing scripture in Qumran, exactly what he's talking about. Every time they got to, there was a person saying it, a person approving it, a person writing it, a person approving it, and when they got to the name of God at any point or any version of the name of God, they would all put down their pens, put down their stuff. They'd walk out. They'd take a ceremonial like baptism, get themselves cleaned up, come back, and pick up where they left off, with the name of God being first. Okay, so they wouldn't say it. So how do we talk about God without talking about God? You talk about where He is. Where is God?
The kingdom of heaven.
He's in heaven. So they are referring to God, but he is being very conscious of not offending these Jews who he's writing to. And so I think it's important, and people are like, oh, that doesn't make any sense. Well, if you were reading a story or telling a story to my 6-year-old, wherever he is, you probably use some simpler language than telling it to my 18-year-old.
Yes.
Because there's some context that he just doesn't quite understand. You're going to have to simplify it into terms that he can comprehend and understand, right?
Right.
You're going to speak differently. You're going to have different emphasis.
On the syllables, yeah.
Yeah. But you're still going to communicate basically the same thing.
But you have to be careful.
Yes, you have to be careful.
The understanding remains.
Yes. And so that whatever he repeats doesn't turn into
Spider-Man.
Whatever happened earlier. He doesn't know what he's saying, but they broke her water yesterday. Okay, you don't know what that means. You're just repeating what I've said a couple times. So
yeah.
And so the audience matters and the author matters. And so a lot of conversations here, things that we're going to continue to flesh out and have a conversation about. And this is why I'm saying, I'm going to reiterate what I said before as we wrap this thing up. We are going to give an outline of the other 3 Gospels over the next 3 weeks. And then we are going to begin to dive into this Gospel narrative. And we are going to spend most of our time walking through the Gospel narrative and the Gospel story through the book of Matthew. And we're going to be challenging and asking some questions. Typically, in the church today, we have more experience with the New Testament than we do the Old Testament.
Certainly.
So as we have spent time in the Old Testament and we've talked through stories and we've asked certain questions, and it's really been enlightening to us because it really taught us some things that we maybe didn't know before, or expanded on saying things that we might have known before. We are going to walk through the New Testament where we probably have more experience, and we are going to challenge some of the things that we have thought we have known. And we're going to ask some questions about some things, and it's going to be important for us to not get buried in it. And the only way for that to happen is to have some community where we can talk it out, figure it out together, chew on it together. And so that's going to be important as we walk through this thing. Um, it is a different world. Like, it really will help us understand a lot of the Gospels, which I think our walk through the Old Testament is really going to help us.
Understanding as you go through, even through this genealogy.
Yeah.
Say, we never questioned it.
Yeah.
Just like the Jewish people then never questioned it, even though they may have known the story better than we did.
If you're a person who likes to read through the Bible in a year, and you get to the New Testament, and you're like, I got to the New Testament, got all the way through the Old Testament, now it's September probably, maybe even October, because there's so much more to the Old Testament than there is to the New Testament. This is the place where you get to Matthew chapter 1, and you're like, I need to read this, and then you fall asleep in the middle because you've read all these names, and you're already tired or something, and you're like, you know what? I got a great solution. I'm going to audiobook listen to this as I'm driving down the road and half pay attention because I've gotten through all the names, and we can move on to the stuff that I really want to listen to.
To the
Christmas story. That's in Matthew chapter 2. Which, again, it's always normal for a betrothed wife to be pregnant.
Mm-hmm.
That's not, yeah.
You didn't discuss why he mentioned Joseph.
That's
not Jesus' true father, but I know it's not important. But that's the problem I've always had, is like, why is he here?
Yeah, so they would just recognize
fulfilling a promise.
Yeah. So lots of good stuff. We're going to have a little bit more discussion here, I'm sure. Thanks for joining us. Join us next time. We'll be back here Sunday morning at 10:30, or next Wednesday sometime around, probably actually closer to 7, but we say 6:30 ish.